Nobody ever told Thomas Whitmore that mercy had a price tag. What they told him through 2 dead winters on the Wyoming plains and the particular loneliness of burying parents too young was that survival meant keeping what was yours and asking no questions about what belonged to someone else. And yet on a November afternoon in 1867, with the first snow dusting the ridgeline and his winter stores down to dried beans and dwindling hope, Thomas found something on his doorstep that broke every rule he had learned about staying alive in a land that forgave nothing. A child, Lakota, maybe 7 years old, maybe younger, unconscious. The kind of unconscious that comes right before the thing nobody wants to name. He stood there longer than he should have, one hand still on the door latch, the wind driving ice crystals against his face. The girl wore a doe-skin dress, torn at the shoulder, and her feet were wrapped in rabbit fur that had come loose on one side. Her lips were blue. Not the blue of cold, the blue of something worse. Thomas knew that color. He had seen it on his mother's lips the winter the fever took her, the winter his father stopped speaking in full sentences and started speaking in silences. He carried the girl inside. The cabin was small, a single room with a stone fireplace. He laid her near the hearth, wrapped her in his mother's only finished quilt, and built the fire higher than he could afford. Then he knelt and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The pulse was there, faint, but there. Outside, his horse stamped in the lean-to, a sorrel gelding, 14 hands with a white blaze and steady temperament. Thomas had bought him with his father's last savings 2 years ago. The horse had no name because Thomas didn't believe in naming things you might have to eat, but he had never seriously considered eating this one. The horse was how he plowed, how he hauled water, how he would survive. Thomas looked at the girl. Her breathing was shallow, labored. He had seen hypothermia before, the body shutting down to save the core. She needed heat, food, protein, fat, something to burn. He stood and walked to the door. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontal, erasing the girl's tracks. He wondered where she had come from, how far she had walked, whether anyone was looking for her. Thomas pulled on his coat and walked to the lean-to. The horse lifted its head, ears forward, eyes calm and trusting. Thomas ran a hand down its neck, feeling the muscle beneath the winter coat, the steady warmth of living flesh. The coat was thick, winter-ready. He thought about the creek, frozen solid since October. The beans in the barrel, enough for maybe 3 weeks if he rationed carefully. The girl's faint pulse growing fainter. He pressed his forehead against the horse's shoulder. Just for a moment. The animal stood patient, breathing slowly, unaware. Thomas felt his throat tighten, felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Then he stepped back. He went back inside, took the rifle from above the door, returned to the lean-to, and raised it with hands that trembled only slightly. One shot. Clean. The sound cracked across the valley like thunder. The horse buckled and went down without sound. And Thomas stood there watching steam rise from the entry wound, watching snow begin to settle on the still warm hide. Thomas butchered in the failing light, hands shaking not from cold, but from something that felt like tearing himself apart. He worked quickly. Heart, liver, kidneys first, then the hindquarters. He wrapped what he could carry and dragged it inside. By the time he had the organ meat cooking, the girl had opened her eyes. She didn't speak. She watched him with stillness that doesn't come from fear, but from something older, something trained. Thomas brought her warm water first. She drank, then liver, cooked rare. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she had come from. He just fed her and kept the fire burning, and when she finally slept, he sat in his father's chair and stared at the flames. She stayed 2 days. On the second morning, she was strong enough to sit up. Thomas cooked more horse meat and watched her eat. When she finished, she walked to the door, pointed north toward the ridgeline, and said a single word in Lakota. He understood the gesture. Home. He wrapped what remained of the meat in oilcloth, tied it into a pack, put on his boots and coat, and followed her into the snow. They walked for 6 hours through snow that grew deeper with each mile. The girl led with certainty, never hesitating, her small form cutting through drifts that came to her chest. Thomas followed, pack heavy across his shoulders, Feet going numb inside boots meant for riding, not walking. By the third hour, his right boot had worn through at the heel. He could feel the cold seeping in, then the wetness. By the fifth hour, there was blood, leaving dark spots in the snow behind him. The girl noticed. She kept glancing back, her dark eyes moving from his face to the red trail he left, but she didn't slow down. If anything, she walked faster, pulling him forward with unspoken urgency. The Lakota camp appeared without warning, tucked into a sheltered valley ringed by pine. Teepees in a half circle, smoke rising thin and gray, dogs barking their alarm. The girl stopped at the edge and turned to look at Thomas. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between fear and something else. Trust, maybe. Then she walked forward and a man emerged from one of the larger teepees. He was tall, broad-shouldered, face carved by weather and years. He wore buckskin leggings and a buffalo robe draped across his shoulders, a bear claw necklace at his throat. His hair was long, braided, with eagle feathers woven through. He looked at the girl, at Thomas, at the pack. His expression unreadable, but his hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. The girl spoke rapidly in Lakota. The man listened. When she finished, he looked at Thomas for a long time, then at Thomas's boots, at the blood soaking through leather, at the pack. Thomas set the pack down. The man stepped forward and knelt. He unlaced Thomas's boot carefully and pulled it off. The sock beneath was red. He looked at the wound, at Thomas's face, at the pack again. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition. He stood and spoke a word. Women emerged from teepees, and within minutes Thomas sat near a fire, his foot being cleaned and wrapped in moss and soft leather. The man stood nearby, watching. The girl sat beside him, holding his hand. Thomas stayed the night. They gave him food and a place to sleep. In the morning, the man whose name he would later learn was Tatanka Patesila, Little Bull, walked him to the camp edge. He didn't speak. He just placed one hand on Thomas's shoulder, squeezed once, and turned back. Thomas walked home alone. It took 2 days. By the time he reached the cabin, snow had covered everything, and his foot had opened again. He didn't lose the toes. 3 days later, he woke to horses. He grabbed the rifle, expecting trouble. What he found were 5 horses tied outside his cabin. Not ponies, hunting horses. Strong, winter-fed, valuable. And beside them, bundles wrapped in hide. Buffalo meat, enough for a winter. And on the doorstep, placed carefully where he would see it first, was a pair of mittens. Beaded, intricate. Small hands had made them. Thomas stood in the cold holding the mittens, looking at the horses. He didn't hear Tatanka Pitesela approach until the man was beside him. The Lakota didn't speak. He gestured toward the cabin, toward the valley, then made a motion with his hands Thomas didn't understand. For the next week, Tatanka Pitesela came every morning at first light. He brought tools Thomas had never seen: curved bone needles, sinew thread, specialized poles cut to precise lengths. He brought hides and quiet patience. Together in the snow and wind, they built a winter shelter. Not a cabin, but a low dome-shaped structure covered in buffalo hide and banked with packed snow. Warmer, more efficient, built to breathe with the land, not against it. They worked in silence that felt less like absence and more like another language entirely. Tatanka would show Thomas how to lash poles at specific angles, how to stretch hide taut without tearing, how to bank snow at the correct pitch for maximum insulation. Thomas would watch, then copy, his movements clumsy at first, then gradually finding their rhythm. When he made mistakes, Tatanka would stop him with a raised hand, demonstrate again with patient precision. When Thomas got it right, Tatanka would nod once and move to the next task. No praise, no criticism, just the work, shared between them like a conversation neither needed to speak aloud. On the 7th day, the shelter was complete. Tatanka stood back and studied it. Then he looked at Thomas. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He placed it in Thomas's hand. Inside was a stone carved into the shape of a horse. Smooth, simple, perfect. Tatanka tapped the stone, then tapped Thomas's chest, then pointed toward the shelter. Thomas understood. The horse was gone. But what it had bought was here, and it would last longer than one winter. The Lakota turned and walked back toward the ridgeline. Thomas watched until he disappeared into the white. Then he looked at the stone horse in his hand, at the shelter, at the 5 horses standing patient. He thought about his sorrel gelding, about the girl's blue lips, about the blood in his boot and the mittens, and the fact that mercy didn't have a price tag after all. It had an answer. Thomas Whitmore survived that winter, and the next. He never named the horses Tatanka had given him, but he never forgot them. And every November, when the first snow came, he would take out the stone horse and the beaded mittens, and remember the afternoon he learned that the cost of doing the right thing was everything he had, and that sometimes if you were willing to pay it, the world gave you something back. Not because you deserved it, but because someone understood what it meant to sacrifice something irreplaceable and decided quietly that you were worth the answer.